I think we should probably move on to some of our other stories, because that was a lot of time on Twitter, which...
We've been spending too much time on Twitter.
We've been
way too much time
on Twitter. I apologize.
It sucks you in, and you can never leave. All right, what's the next topic, Chris?
I think the next big thing is, well, as of this recording, Beijing has not gone under lockdown. However, that is the big conversation people are having. It's like they've started doing mandatory testings. In Beijing, there's been, some cases, not many, but some cases, if you believe official numbers, which none of us do. And this is how it kind of began in Shanghai. There was mandatory testing, and then we got to lock down some areas. And then we have to lock down half the city. We'll do half the city at a time. And then total lockdown, people are starving in their apartments.
Yeah, I don't think Beijing is going to follow exactly that model. I think Shanghai... Basically, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to be Beijing is the good child, if you know what I mean. Beijing is better than Shanghai. It's going to do way better at the zero COVID than Shanghai did. Shanghai messed up. Yeah, that's basically there's always been this thing between Beijing and Shanghai, right? Where there's a rivalry almost. It's like New York and Washington, D.C. or something.
No contest.
Well... The idea is that Beijing is more governed, right, because it's the center of political power. Shanghai had been the business center of China for decades, so it's about as quote-unquote freewheeling as you can get in China. So a lot of the criticism around the Shanghai leadership was that, they didn't lock down soon enough. They didn't lock down hard enough. If they had just clamped down immediately, they could have... because Shanghai is reporting hundreds of thousands of COVID cases, which is a lot for the official numbers in China. So everybody was like, people from outside Shanghai were like, if they just did it the right way, because they had tried to have their own type of lockdown where they were only locking down neighborhoods, or they were trying to pilot this new way of doing it. They even talked about letting people quarantine at home, all this kind of stuff. And seem to be pushing back against the zero COVID policy. And, the message from Beijing is that that's not okay. You stick to the plan.
Well, but I don't understand how Beijing sees this now. If Shanghai has hundreds of thousands of cases and other cities have cases, the only way for Beijing to actually have zero cases is to never let anyone into Beijing again.
They could do that.
That might not be the most unappealing thing to the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, but it's crazy.
The movement, if we don't talk about just hard lockdowns, actually locking people inside their apartment buildings or complexes and not letting them go outside, or only restricting them to being within the complex, right? If you just talk about movement restrictions, there are, hundreds of millions of Chinese people under movement restrictions right now. Certain areas are not going to let people in, certain areas are not going to let people out. Yeah, that's...
And the Communist Party has always limited the movement of Chinese people throughout the country. You can't... It's not like the United States where you can just casually go from one state to another. You can't go from one province to another easily, because there's that whole Hukou system.
Well, you can go there. That's not the problem. But you can't live there easily. If you have... Hukou is a ID system, essentially, that tells you where you're allowed to live. So if you have a rural Hukou, if you have a countryside Hukou, you cannot go live in a city. So, that's one of the problems with... You have all these migrant workers from around the country, and they're mostly coming from the poor countryside areas. They go to the cities to work in factories, to work in construction, and they can't technically live there. So they're reduced to kind of living in the outskirts of cities in these sometimes quasi-illegal neighborhoods. Their kids can't go to school, so often they leave the kids behind in the countryside. It's like having a kind of illegal immigrant system, but within your own country.
Yeah. And so my point is that the Communist Party does already try to control the movement of Chinese people. I don't think it's that much of a stretch to say that they would try to create a zero COVID bubble around Beijing.
It just seems like...
They did it for the Olympics.
Yeah.
And what happened in the Olympics bubble?
Everyone had a great time, and the Olympics were a model for the world.
And Putin didn't invade Ukraine until after the Olympics, so everything was good.
And how about with respect to COVID?
They had some cases, but they were basically able to keep it's separate from the rest of Beijing. Like literally you had people, if you were going to go work at the Olympics, you needed to be quarantined for like 3 to 4 weeks before even going inside the bubble.
Right, but they still had cases in the bubble. Is what happened.
But supposedly they were from people coming in from other countries to the Olympics.
Yeah, well, this is going to be an impossible situation for Beijing. And anyway, the sort of walls around the Olympics bubble were very small compared to the walls you'd need to build around Beijing. And I don't mean necessarily physical walls, but just the barriers to entry. Like Beijing is geographically very large, and there's so many roads going in and out.
Did we talk about on this? I don't think we talked about on the podcast the woman who got stuck on a bridge between Beijing and another city because both sides went into lockdown while she was driving on the bridge.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's
crazy. Yeah. Well, I mean, after many hours, she was able to get one side to let her in. But like that's the kind of weirdness of Chinese bureaucracy. Like they can lock down immediately, but then if you have a edge case or something that's an exception, they can't deal with it.
Yeah. Well, that's why like you've seen panic buying in Beijing as people, they have seen on social media in China that people in Shanghai have been starving, complaining about there's no food. And so now that's happening in China. There was that case of the Chinese state-run media reporter who tweeted a picture of herself at a supermarket and the shelves were empty, and she's like, "Oh, blah blah blah."
She's like, "I'm buying stuff. We're all getting ready for the possible lockdown."
And then that was deleted, and the next day she posted another photo of her at the supermarket, and the shelves were filled.
And she's like, "I just panicked. I was overthinking yesterday, right?"
Yeah, well, we'll put that up.
Yeah,
but
like
as a reporter, you really shouldn't be thinking very much.
Just let the Communist Party think for you. They make all the best decisions.
Well, here's the thing. I don't know how much the ordinary people in Beijing are believing the whole line about, well, we're not Shanghai, so it's gonna go great here.
Yeah. Well, because the Shanghai lockdown, despite the kind of the Beijing Shanghai kind of divide, it was shocking that happened in Shanghai. Such an economically important part of China was so completely shut down.
I mean, that's one of the reasons the Shanghai officials at first tried to argue that they didn't need to lock the city down, or they couldn't because so much of the country relies on Shanghai, right?
Yeah.
That was actually what they said. Like, we can't go into a lockdown right now because
Well, and also, these are the elites, really, of Chinese society. They're not usually the ones who are getting persecuted by the party. So,
I mean, there are plenty of non-elite in Shanghai.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. But this is one of the cases where it's like a new group of people is suffering under the Communist Party that has not.
Although also, it's very uneven what happened in Shanghai. Mm-hmm. Like some people had food.
Yeah.
Some people couldn't get food for weeks. Like some people got a few packages from the government. Some people got like a dozen packages from the government. So it's like it was very unevenly distributed in terms of like how people were experiencing the lockdown. Because Shanghai has 25 million people.
Something about distribution in communist societies. Anyways, go on.
But yeah, so your experience could vary a lot. And then people in Shanghai, but still, I think people in Shanghai felt like they were all in it together. And then areas outside Shanghai did the thing where they were like, oh, well, like Shanghai just messed up. Like because of the way that Chinese WeChat is, you only see your friends' social media posts. So a lot of people in Shanghai were seeing all of the terrible things happening in Shanghai. But if you lived, somewhere else and you had no friends in Shanghai, you would not know how bad it was. Right?
That's the way like an authoritarian government maintains power, like to always be able to like marginalize a group and blame, victim blame essentially. Like, oh yeah, it's Shanghai's problem. Don't worry, Beijing will not. But if Beijing does go into a lockdown kind of like this, like that'll be huge. I mean, that really is the elite of Chinese society.
Oh yeah, well, I don't think in Zhongnanhai they're gonna have a problem getting food or anything, but
probably not. I'm sure Xi Jinping won't go
but
hungry.